Picture someone in their early 30s sitting at a decent desk in a clean office, at a company with a name that sounds impressive enough at dinner parties. Their contract is stable, their pay is above the national median, their manager mostly leaves them alone, and their colleagues are fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. By pretty much every metric that society uses to measure whether you've made it, this person has. They did the right degree, put in the years, got the title, and landed exactly the kind of job that their parents would describe as a good one. And yet, they spend a lot of time staring at the door. Not because they're lazy, not because they're ungrateful, but because something about the whole arrangement feels quietly wrong in a way they can't quite put into words. The salary that felt like a win when they signed the contract somehow doesn't stretch as far as it was supposed to. The sense of purpose that everyone implied would just show up eventually hasn't. And the strange part is that when they look around, they realize this isn't just them. Almost everyone they know, regardless of what industry they're in or what they earn, is carrying some version of the same low-level dissatisfaction. The same unresolved question of, is this actually it? This video is an attempt to answer that question properly. Not with a list of habits to adopt or a reframe about gratitude, but by actually tracing the structural forces that created this situation in the first place. So as always, we've got some important questions to work through. Why do so many people today feel like their jobs are falling short, even when the job itself looks fine on paper? What does the actual data say about wages, satisfaction, and whether the gap between the two is a genuine economic failure or just a problem of expectations? And what happens to an economy when the trust between workers and employers quietly breaks down at scale? Here's the first thing worth understanding. The dissatisfaction people feel about their jobs today isn't really about the jobs themselves. It's about what those jobs were silently promised to deliver, and that promise has a pretty specific origin story. For most of human history, work wasn't expected to be meaningful. It was expected to keep you alive, and nobody was particularly confused about that distinction. A farmer didn't expect plowing a field to give them a sense of identity. A craftsman might take pride in the quality of their work, sure, but the work wasn't being asked to answer any deep questions about who they were as a person. That's a very modern expectation, and it showed up roughly in the middle of the 20th century, right alongside the expansion of the professional middle class, the mass growth of university education, and a cultural shift that began tying a person's career to their self-worth in a way that had basically no historical precedent. What that shift produced was a whole generation of workers entering the job market with a set of expectations that the market was never actually built to meet. They were told through school, through their families, through the general cultural air, that the right career would feel engaging, that it would give them purpose, that the hard work of building it would be proportionally rewarded, and that the salary at the end of it would feel like fair payment for the years of effort, debt, and delayed gratification that getting qualified required. That is, to put it mildly, a lot to promise. And the evidence is increasingly clear that for a growing share of workers, the delivery is falling well short of the pitch. Now, psychologists have a name for part of what's happening here, the hedonic adaptation treadmill. And it's worth spending a moment on because it explains something that a lot of people feel but can't articulate. The basic idea is this: humans are remarkably quick to adapt to positive changes in their circumstances, including financial ones, and then return to roughly the same baseline level of satisfaction they had before. A salary increase that genuinely felt exciting at the time of negotiation tends within a few months to just feel like normal, at which point the things that were once tolerable start feeling inadequate again, and the search for the next thing kicks back in. This isn't a personal failing or a sign that someone is never satisfied. It's just how human cognition works. The problem is that it interacts very badly with a work culture that has trained people to use their compensation as the main signal of whether their career is worth anything. Alright, let's look at the actual numbers because the psychology here is real, but it doesn't exist in isolation, and the economic data sitting underneath it is honestly more troubling than the psychology. In most advanced economies, the 3 decades following World War II produced something economists describe as broad-based wage growth. What that means in practice is that as the economy grew and workers became more productive, the gains from that productivity were actually distributed fairly widely across the income spectrum. Workers at the median were genuinely capturing a meaningful share of the value they were generating. A factory worker during this period could, on a single income, afford a house, a car, raise a family, and have something resembling real financial stability. Not a lavish life, the houses were modest, college was rare, and the prosperity certainly wasn't equally distributed. But the basic social contract held. Put in the work and the reward follows. Then something changed. And this is one of the most significant and least talked about economic stories of the last 40 years. In the United States, labor productivity, the measure of how much economic output gets generated per hour of work, grew by somewhere between 60 and 70% between 1979 and 2020, depending on the measurement window. Over that exact same period, median hourly compensation for non-supervisory workers, which is about 80% of the U.S. workforce, grew by somewhere between 11 and 17% in real terms, depending on which inflation measure you apply. That's a divergence of around 45 to 50 percentage points. Workers helped generate significantly more value. They didn't get significantly more pay. The math on that gap is not subtle. The UK and much of Western Europe tell a similar story, even if the numbers are slightly less extreme. Real wage growth stagnated badly in the decade after the 2008 financial crisis. And then the inflation spike of 2021 and 2022 came along and erased years of nominal gains in a matter of months. The OECD documented that real wages across its member countries fell by an average of 3.8% between early 2022 and early 2023, a decline recorded in 30 out of 34 countries with available data, and one of the sharpest drops seen in the postwar period. So when we come back to the person at the desk, the one with the stable contract median salary who still can't shake the feeling that something's off, here's what the data is actually telling us. Corporate profits as a share of GDP in most advanced economies hit multi-decade highs through the 2010s. Housing costs in major metropolitan areas have consistently grown faster than wages for years, meaning that the implicit deal, do the right things, build the right career, and you'll be able to afford the life that career was supposed to unlock, has become genuinely harder to pull off, even for people who did everything they were told to do. And that's what makes this version of job dissatisfaction different from older versions of it. This isn't about people choosing the wrong career or having expectations that are out of touch with reality. It's about a growing number of people who played by the rules of a framework and are now finding that the framework quietly moved while nobody was making any announcements about it. Nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but we can look at what actually happens to economies when the trust between workers and institutions starts to quietly break down. And the picture isn't great. One of the most measurable effects is what labor economists call the disengagement problem. This refers to the growing share of workers who are technically showing up, technically meeting their minimum requirements, but who have more or less stopped putting in any real discretionary effort. Gallup has been tracking workplace engagement globally for about 2 decades, and their numbers are pretty striking. In their most recent State of the Global Workplace report from 2024, 62% of workers worldwide fell into the not engaged category, meaning they're doing enough to keep their job, but not much more. A further 15% were classified as actively disengaged, which means they're not just checked out, they're actively making things worse around them. Combined, that's roughly 77% of the global workforce operating well below what they're actually capable of. And to put a price tag on that, Gallup estimates the cost of this disengagement at around $8.8 trillion in lost productivity globally, which is roughly 9% of world GDP. That is not a rounding error. The macroeconomic implications of that are significant and mostly go undiscussed in policy conversations. A workforce running substantially below its productive potential isn't just a people management problem. It's a growth problem. Modern economic growth depends heavily on what economists call total factor productivity, which is basically the portion of output growth that can't be explained by capital investment or the number of hours worked. It's the stuff that comes from people actually trying, sharing knowledge, solving problems, innovating at the margins. Disengaged workers systematically withhold all of that. And it doesn't show up anywhere in a quarterly report until years later when the organization wonders why it stopped improving. The demographic angle makes this worse. The workforce cohorts currently moving into their peak productive years, roughly the 25 to 40 age bracket, are behaving noticeably differently from their predecessors. Job tenure is shorter. Career pivots are more common and carry much less social stigma than they once did. The idea that an employer is owed loyalty simply because they're paying a salary has weakened considerably, and the pandemic accelerated that shift in a very direct way. It gave millions of workers a large-scale, real-world experiment in remote work, and many of them came out of it with a much clearer picture of which parts of the traditional office arrangement were actually necessary and which parts were just habit. What this produces at the system level is a labor market that looks fine by the usual metrics. Unemployment rates across most OECD countries remain relatively contained, positions eventually get filled, the work gets done, but that is slowly losing the depth of institutional knowledge, collaborative coherence, and long-term commitment that makes organizations genuinely productive over time, rather than just technically functional. But the deepest part of this problem isn't really economic. Or rather, it starts economic, but it becomes something more fundamental, which is a genuine cultural confusion about where meaning is actually supposed to come from and what role work was ever actually equipped to play in providing it. The idea that your job defines who you are isn't some timeless truth about the human condition. It's a fairly recent and geographically specific set of values that emerged from a specific window of postwar affluence. And it was always a fragile premise. The conditions that made it feel plausible, rising real wages, accessible homeownership, the reasonable expectation of career stability, were real features of a particular economic era. But those conditions have weakened considerably. What hasn't weakened, and in some ways has gotten louder, is the cultural messaging that links professional achievement to personal worth. LinkedIn is essentially an entire platform built on that premise. So is a significant chunk of what passes for aspiration in social media more broadly. The result is a generation of workers in a genuinely strange position. They're expected to derive their sense of self from their careers. They're financially constrained in ways that make heavy career investment feel increasingly like a poor return on effort. And they're surrounded by a media environment that presents exceptional professional outcomes. The 28-year-old founder, the executive with the 7-figure salary, the creative person with the global platform, as if these are realistic benchmarks rather than statistical outliers. That specific combination of high expectation, financial squeeze, and distorted reference points is, if you think about it, almost precisely engineered to produce chronic, ambient dissatisfaction. What a more honest framework would acknowledge is something much simpler. Work is, at its most functional, a mechanism for trading effort for economic security, and economic security is the prerequisite for everything else. Autonomy, connection, genuine purpose, the freedom to give real attention to whatever actually matters to you. None of those things can take root reliably in the absence of financial stability. When the salary is real and the stability holds, work naturally shrinks to its appropriate place in a life and makes room for everything that actually generates meaning. When neither condition is being reliably met, work expands to fill every available psychological space. Not because it's fulfilling, but because financial stress is cognitively all-consuming in a way that crowds out basically everything else. So, where does that leave the person at the desk? Probably not where they were hoping when they clicked on this video, because the honest answer to why work feels this way doesn't resolve into a neat set of things to go and do differently. The dissatisfaction is real. The structural forces driving it are real. And the gap between what the labor market was sold as and what it's actually delivering for a very large share of workers is a genuine economic phenomenon, not a mindset issue, not a generational failure of toughness, and not something that corrects itself without deliberate choices about wages, housing costs, and how career development actually gets structured and funded. What is also true is that understanding the mechanism behind a feeling changes your relationship with it, not because the understanding makes the discomfort disappear, but because it places it more accurately. Someone who feels like a failure because their career hasn't made them feel whole is carrying a weight that was never theirs to carry. Someone who understands that the promise itself was structurally flawed is at least working with accurate information. And accurate information is almost always a better starting point, whether what comes next is advocacy, adaptation, or a quieter renegotiation of what you actually expect from your working hours and what you decide to build your sense of meaning around instead. The economics of this don't end here. Make sure to subscribe and keep following the channel to learn exactly how to navigate this profound economic shift in coming videos.